They singled her out from the crowd. An older woman. Nothing remarkable at first glance. Just another traveler to process, to scrutinize, to dismiss. But when security ordered her to open her bags for inspection, something in her eyes changed. Not fear, not anger. Something deeper, as if a long-buried memory had suddenly resurfaced. The officers smirked as they began rifling through her belongings, never suspecting that this routine search would become a moment none of them would ever forget. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you appreciate stories about unsung heroes and moments of unexpected dignity, consider subscribing to support more content like this. The security lines stretched through the atrium of the government building, a snaking testament to bureaucracy. Rain lashed against the tall windows, casting a gray pall over the already tense atmosphere. Elira stood in line, perfectly straight despite her 68 years. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her clothing plain but immaculate, unlike those around her who slouched with impatience or stared at phones. She kept her eyes forward, hands clasped before her, waiting. The checkpoint buzzed with the constant beep of metal detectors and the harried voices of security personnel. Officer Brannick, a man in his 30s with a perpetual frown and a uniform that seemed one size too small for his frame, scanned the line with practiced suspicion. His gaze lingered on Elira longer than necessary before he beckoned her forward with a sharp gesture. "ID," he said, palm outstretched. Elira produced an identification card from her purse and placed it in his hand. The lamination was yellowed around the edges. Officer Brannick turned the card over, frowning. "This is expired." "The appointment letter said it would be acceptable," Elira replied, her voice soft but clear. She reached into her bag and produced an official-looking letter with a government seal. Brannick barely glanced at it before handing it back. "Purpose of your visit today?" "I have an appointment," she answered simply. "An appointment for what?" Officer Brannick pressed, his voice rising just enough to draw attention from nearby travelers. Elira hesitated. "It is personal." Her vagueness only heightened his suspicion. As other travelers, younger, louder, more fashionably dressed, were waved through with cursory checks, Officer Brannick's focus on Elira intensified. He called over his colleague, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and a nameplate reading, Halbier. "Officer Halbier, can you assist with a secondary screening?" Halbier approached, eyeing Elira with the same unearned suspicion. "Step aside, ma'am." Elira complied immediately, her posture shifting subtly into what almost resembled a position of attention. When she responded with an automatic "Yes, sir," Officer Brannick's eyebrows raised slightly. "That bag," he pointed to her worn duffel, separate from the small rolling suitcase she carried. "Open it." "May I request a private screening?" Elira asked quietly. Officer Brannick exchanged glances with Halbier. "No. Open it here." Rain still dripped from Elira's coat as she stood before them, dignity intact but patience wearing thin. The checkpoint's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face as a small crowd of onlookers began to gather, sensing the brewing confrontation. "Is there a problem?" Elira asked, her voice betraying nothing. "That depends on what you have in the bag," Brannick replied. A group of young office workers had stopped to watch, their morning coffee forgotten in their hands. One woman frowned at the scrutiny being given to the older woman but said nothing. The rain continued to drum against the windows, providing a soundtrack to the tension. Elira set the duffel on the table and unzipped it partway. "I would prefer privacy," she repeated. "And I would prefer compliance," Officer Brannick said, his voice harder now. "We can do this here, or we can take you to a room where the questions get a lot more thorough. Your choice." Something flickered in Elira's eyes. Not fear, but a calculation and assessment. It was the look of someone who had made difficult decisions before. "Very well," she said at last, stepping back. Officer Brannick snapped on a pair of latex gloves with theatrical flair. The snap echoed through the checkpoint, drawing even more attention. "Since you are being difficult, we will do this ourselves." The crowd grew, phones appearing to record the spectacle. Elira's expression remained neutral, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Not fear, but resignation. She had been here before in different ways, different places. "What is so important in this bag that you need privacy?" Halbier asked, already unzipping the main compartment. They began removing her possessions one by one, displaying them on the cold metal table, a prescription bottle of pills, a carefully wrapped framed photograph that they did not unwrap, a dog-eared copy of Tennyson's poems. Each item extracted with less care than the last. A young office worker whispered to his colleague, "This feels wrong." His friend nodded but kept watching, unable to look away from the quiet humiliation unfolding before them. "What is this?" Brannick held up a small, unusual key. Ornate and clearly old. It opens something that should have stayed closed, Elira replied, her voice steady but distant. The officers laughed. Very mysterious, Brannick mocked. Old spy movie fan, are we? As they continued their search, more personal items emerged. Things that should remain private. A handwritten letter, a medical document with test results clearly visible, each displayed for all to see under the harsh lights. Resemblance Operation 1976, Halbier read from a small notebook he had found, mangling the pronunciation. What is that? Your bridge club. Elira remained silent, eyes fixed forward as if she had weathered worse storms than this public humiliation. These old people and their secrets, Brannick said loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear, always think they are more important than they are. Elira's silence seemed to irritate him further. He dug deeper into the bag, pulling out a small box. And what is this? He asked, opening it without permission. Inside was a small metal pin, unmarked, but clearly military in design. A memento? Elira answered simply. Of what? Brannick pressed. Of people who were gone now. The officer rolled his eyes and tossed the box back onto the table, not bothering to close it. The pin slid out, clattering against the metal surface. Elira's eyes followed it, the first real reaction she had shown. Careful with that, please, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Oh, is it valuable? Brannick asked with mock concern. Maybe we should have it appraised. Not in money, Elira replied. Elira sat upright in the leather chair at the end of the wide corridor, her duffel bag now returned and resting neatly at her feet. The uniform jacket, once hidden from view, was folded precisely in her lap, the insignia barely visible beneath the fabric's sharp creases. Ahead of her, a heavy metal door marked the entrance to a private elevator that would take her to the top floor for the ceremony. The events at the security checkpoint still echoed faintly in her mind, but she had long since learned not to let such things linger. There was a calm in her now, not because the indignity had passed, but because she had endured it with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through much more dangerous trials. Footsteps approached steadily from down the corridor. General Alaric Crane appeared, dressed impeccably in his formal uniform, a black case in hand. His gaze was focused, respectful, and when he reached her, he inclined his head slightly. The elevator is ready, Captain Thorne. Elira rose. I'm still not used to being called that after so long. It's the only name I'll use for you, Crane said. It's time your rank was restored, publicly. They entered the elevator and the doors sealed behind them with a soft hiss. The quiet hum of the motor filled the space as they ascended. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Elira broke the silence. Are the others here? Commander Reed is seated already. Ella Foster arrived an hour ago. 2 others are being brought in from the outpost. Elira nodded slowly. I'm glad some of them are still alive. Crane glanced at her. You didn't come for the medal. No, she agreed. I came for them. And because it finally matters that it happened. The elevator opened to reveal a gleaming marble hallway bathed in sunlight from tall windows. High-ranking security personnel stood at intervals along the walls, their postures rigid. As Elira passed with the uniform jacket in hand, a few glanced toward it before returning to attention, recognizing the quiet gravity of what was about to unfold. Inside the grand hall, rows of chairs were already filled with military officers, dignitaries, and the families of veterans. At the front, a cluster of elderly individuals sat together, those few who had once shared secrets, missions, and losses that no one else had ever known. Elira, a white-haired man, called softly as she entered. Commander Malcolm Reed rose to greet her. He took her hand firmly, eyes scanning her face. Didn't think we'd see this day. Some of us didn't, Elira replied. But we remember them, said Ella Foster, standing nearby. And now they're remembered officially. They sat together, a small line of living history stitched together by memory and sacrifice. The music changed. Everyone stood as the president entered, flanked by military leadership. The room fell into reverent silence. The ceremony began with crisp protocol. One by one, the surviving members of the once-shadowed unit were called forward. When Elira's name was announced, she rose and walked to the podium with the same unwavering posture she had held at the checkpoint. The president spoke of Operation Resemblance, the limited facts now declassified, the rescue of 37 hostages, the prevention of an international crisis, the contributions of a unit that had never officially existed. He spoke of Elira's linguistic skills, her leadership under fire, her decisions that had changed the course of history in the shadows. When he pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to the jacket she now wore, Elira's face remained composed, but behind her eyes she carried the weight of names unspoken. The applause that followed was long and sustained. Elira responded with a formal salute, not for the crowd, but for those who were no longer here to receive the same honor. The reception hall was elegant and bright, filled with the soft murmur of conversation, the clink of glassware, and the muted shuffle of dress shoes on polished stone. Large windows framed the city skyline, now washed clean from the earlier rain. Elira stood near the edge of the room, holding a glass of water in one hand, her other arm resting gently on the duffel bag now slung over her shoulder. She wore the jacket once more, her jacket now bearing the Distinguished Service Cross just below the faded name patch. Around her, dignitaries and military personnel mingled with cautious reverence, clearly aware they were in the presence of history, though most only understood fragments of it. General Crane approached, 2 glasses of champagne in hand, offering one to her with a quiet smile. "Strange, isn't it?" he asked. "Being celebrated for something we were never allowed to mention." Elira declined the drink with a shake of her head. "Recognition is a peculiar thing, Alaric, especially when it arrives decades too late. But deserved," he said firmly. "Long overdue." Elira didn't respond, instead letting her gaze sweep across the room. Commander Reed was deep in conversation with a pair of young officers. Ella Foster was smiling faintly as a senator attempted to thank her for her service with carefully rehearsed words. Across the room, a familiar figure stood hesitantly near the entrance, Officer Adira Ellis, now out of uniform, dressed simply in civilian clothes, her posture uncertain, her eyes scanning the room until they found Elira. She approached with tentative steps. "Captain Thorne," she said quietly. "I hope this isn't inappropriate. General Crane invited me." Elira nodded once. "You're not intruding." Adira took a breath. "I wanted to apologize properly for how you were treated. For not saying something when I should have." Elira studied the young woman, her expression unreadable. "You weren't the one who mocked, but you are the one who reflects. That already puts you ahead of most." "I keep thinking about what you said," Adira continued. "About service happening where no one is watching." Elira raised an eyebrow slightly. "And what have you concluded?" "That I haven't been living up to that idea," Adira admitted. "I wanted to protect people. That's why I joined. But lately, I felt like I've just been enforcing lines and checking IDs. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what it was supposed to be about." "That happens," Elira said. "Especially in institutions that value control over understanding. Power, even in small amounts, distorts easily." "How did you deal with it?" Adira asked. "The disrespect. The dismissal. Especially as a woman in that role at that time." Elira looked past her for a moment, remembering. "With dignity," she said at last. "Not because I always felt dignified, but because holding on to it meant they couldn't take it from me. When they try to reduce you, the greatest resistance is to remain whole." Adira nodded, absorbing every word. "Thank you. For the example. For everything." Elira inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. "What will you do now?" "Try to live up to what you lived through," Adira said. Elira let a small smile flicker at the corner of her lips. "That's a start." Behind them, the reception continued, stories told in hushed tones, medals examined by curious hands, photographs taken with hands on shoulders and flashes of forced smiles. But Elira remained apart, the noise a distant hum. General Crane returned to her side. "They're hoping for a statement. A full account of Operation Resemblance now that it's declassified. I told them you might speak." Elira's gaze moved to a knot of reporters near the edge of the room, their eyes watching her with subtle expectation. "No," she said firmly. "Some things belong to those who lived them. They don't need to be made into spectacle. Recognition is enough. Exhibition is unnecessary." Crane nodded. "As you wish, Captain." "Not a captain," she said softly. "Just someone who did what had to be done." The late afternoon sun filtered in golden through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the marble floor. As the reception wound down, Elira picked up her bag, now heavier with the metal that marked a truth long hidden. At the entrance, Adira waited, no longer hesitant. "Captain Thorne," she said, "would it be all right if I walked with you? I have more questions. Not about missions. About meaning." Elira paused, then nodded once. "Walk with me." Together, they stepped out of the building and into the fresh, rain-washed air. Elira said nothing at first, but as they moved down the steps and into the quiet street beyond, she began to speak, not of classified operations, but of silent duty, unseen strength, and the kind of courage that isn't rewarded, only carried. Behind them, the government building gleamed in the sunlight, its security checkpoint still processing travelers, each one deserving, Elira thought, of the same basic dignity she had fought to preserve in silence for a lifetime. They walked in silence at first, the sound of their footsteps blending with the steady rhythm of a city returning to normalcy. Cars passed, oblivious. People moved along sidewalks with the indifference of strangers. The streets were still damp, reflecting the soft golden light that filtered through the evening sky. Elira walked with calm purpose, her duffel slung over one shoulder, Officer Adira Ellis keeping pace beside her, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. Elira didn't speak immediately. She had learned over a lifetime of silence that words mattered most when given space to form. Finally, after a few blocks, she said, "You said you had questions." Adira nodded. "I do. But I don't even know where to start." "I guess, how did you know that what you were doing mattered even when no one saw it? When no one would ever know?" Elira considered the question for several steps. "You don't always know," she replied. "There were times I doubted everything. Times I thought we had sacrificed for nothing. But meaning isn't something you wait to be handed. It's something you choose. We decided it mattered because the lives we saved mattered. That had to be enough." Adira looked down at the wet sidewalk. "But the secrecy, doesn't it feel like it erased you?" "No," Elira said. "It preserved something. The people we helped, they got to live their lives not knowing how close they came to losing them. That's a kind of legacy too. You don't always have to be remembered to have made a difference." They crossed at a light, waiting while traffic passed. A street musician played something soft and wandering from a corner nearby. "What was the hardest part?" Adira asked quietly. Elira didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was low, reflective. "Losing people and not being able to say their names. Writing letters I could never send. Knowing someone died beside me and their family never knew why. That was the hardest part. Not the danger. The silence afterward." Adira stopped walking for a moment, struck by the weight of that. "Did you ever wish you'd said no? Refused to join?" "No," Elira said immediately. "I said yes because I could do things others couldn't. Because I was needed. I knew it then. I know it now. The cost doesn't change the reason." They reached a park bench near the edge of a small green space, the kind people often walk past without noticing. Elira sat down, setting her bag beside her. Adira hesitated, then joined her. "You told me at the checkpoint that respect isn't earned by insignia," Adira said after a moment. "I've been thinking about that. I think sometimes the uniform makes people feel powerful in the wrong way. Like it entitles them to be above others rather than in service to them." Elira gave her a long, thoughtful look. "Then your job is to remind them what the uniform is for. Service, not authority. Responsibility, not superiority." Adira looked at her hands. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough to do that." "You are," Elira said simply. "Because you're asking the question. Because you care. You don't have to be unshakable. You just have to keep standing back up." A light wind stirred the leaves above them. The sun was slipping lower now, painting everything in bronze. Adira turned to her. "Do you think I'll ever do anything that matters that much?" Elira didn't answer right away. Then she said, "You already have. You listened. You learned. You showed someone dignity when they had none left to give. That matters more than you think." Adira looked away quickly, hiding a flicker of emotion. She nodded. "Thank you, Captain Thorne." "Just Elira," she said. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the day slipping toward evening. In the distance, lights flickered on across the city. Eventually, Elira stood and lifted her bag. "I have somewhere to be." Adira stood too. "Will I see you again?" Elira gave a small smile. "Perhaps. But you don't need me to keep walking forward." As she turned and began to walk away, Adira watched her go, this woman who had once carried secrets and now, finally, carried honor. She didn't stop her. Some stories are meant to continue quietly, just beyond the edge of notice. And in that moment, beneath the twilight sky, Adira understood what kind of service she wanted her life to stand for. Not the kind that demanded recognition, but the kind that earned it in silence. Elira stood at the edge of the reflecting pool just beyond the Capitol grounds, where the world was quiet enough to think. The water was still, touched only by the occasional ripple from a passing breeze, and the mirrored sky above was painted in soft streaks of lavender and gold. She had always found comfort near water, its depth, its silence, its way of holding secrets without judgment. In her hands was the letter. Folded carefully, worn from years of being carried, never mailed. She unfolded it now, fingers steady despite the tremble that wanted to rise in her bones. The letter was addressed to no one. Or to someone long gone. Perhaps to herself. The words were spare, direct, written in a neat hand trained to leave nothing ambiguous. "I kept my promise. We all did in the ways we could. I don't know if it was enough. But I carried your name every day I lived. I will carry it until the end." She didn't cry. She rarely did. But as she stood there alone, bathed in the fading light of day, something inside her eased, something that had been tightly wounded for far too long. Recognition had come, but it wasn't what brought her peace. It was the fact that she had endured. Behind her, footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. General Crane. He said nothing at first, simply stood beside her, hands clasped behind his back, the silence between them thick with understanding. You didn't come to the dinner, he said finally. I wasn't hungry for speeches, Elira replied. I've heard enough ceremony to last a lifetime. He nodded, unsurprised. They missed you. No, she said. They missed the idea of me. The symbol. That's what they really wanted to see. Crane exhaled through his nose, eyes still on the water. Does it help? Any of it? Elira folded the letter again and tucked it back into her pocket. Some, she admitted. Not in the way they think. Not with medals or salutes. But the truth being spoken aloud, yes. That helps. You could speak more of it. To others. There are younger generations who would listen. She gave a faint smile. I think they need to discover their own truths. I can offer guidance. But they need to do the living. Crane glanced at her, something like admiration in his expression. You always were better at knowing when not to speak than the rest of us. I was trained for it, she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only fact. He reached into his coat and held out a small folder. This is the full declassification. Resemblance. The mission. The names. Everything they'll allow. You're cleared to share it now if you want to. She looked at the folder but didn't take it. Not yet. Will you? Maybe. But not to strangers. If I speak, it will be to the ones who ask because they care. Not because they're curious. Crane tucked the folder back into his coat. Understood. A pause, and then Elira said, Do you ever think about what we could have done if we'd been allowed to lead openly? If none of it had been hidden? All the time, Crane said. But then I remember the work still got done. Even in the dark. A light breeze picked up again. Elira inhaled deeply. I should go, she said. There's a train out at midnight. I prefer quiet stations. Crane gave her a long look. Will you stay in contact? She considered that. You'll know how to find me. You always have. They parted without ceremony, without a salute. Just a nod and the quiet understanding of people who had shared what others never would. Elira walked slowly toward the edge of the city where lights began to flicker on and the night settled in with gentle grace. She passed unnoticed among the crowd, an older woman, nothing remarkable, a traveler with a worn bag and quiet eyes. But within her walked decades of silent valor and a soul unshaken by history's indifference. She had no need for recognition now. Only the freedom to carry her story on her own terms and maybe, just maybe, to share it one day with someone ready to hear not just the heroics but the cost. The train station was quiet when she arrived. The platform nearly empty. She waited alone, upright, the duffel by her feet, the letter safe in her coat, and the past behind her at last. When the train came, she stepped aboard without hesitation, not to escape anything but to move forward, finally, on her own track. The train cut through the dark countryside like a whisper, its interior humming with quiet energy. Outside the window, fields and trees passed in a blur, cast in shades of silver by the moonlight. Inside the compartment, Elira sat alone, her bag tucked beneath her feet, the folded jacket resting on her lap. She hadn't spoken since boarding. There had been no need. Silence had always served her well, more than speeches, more than medals. It gave her space to think and to listen for the things no one else heard. Across the aisle, a young man in civilian clothes dozed against the window, his laptop bag wedged under his knees. A mother further down the car rocked a sleeping child in her arms. Normal lives. Everyday lives. Elira watched them quietly. There had been a time she believed she could never have that. In many ways, she still didn't. But she had protected it for others. That had been enough. The train slowed as it approached a small town station, lights glowing faintly through the fog. No one moved to disembark. Elira didn't either. But as the train paused, she saw something outside that made her straighten. A mural on the wall of the station, a painting of a woman in a military jacket standing before a helicopter. The figure's face was abstract, features obscured. But the posture was unmistakable, straight-backed, calm, resolute. It was a tribute to someone unnamed. Elira looked at it for a long moment. Then the train moved again, and the image faded into the mist. She reached into her coat and withdrew the small leather notebook that had caused so much trouble at the checkpoint. The one marked with the word Resemblance, its contents coded and obscured, meaningless to anyone without the key. She turned to the first page. Inside, not a list of operations or mission reports, but names. Only names. She read them silently. Callan. Mora. Finch. Sato. Reed. Foster. The others. Her hand rested lightly on the page. She didn't weep, but her throat tightened. She took out a pen and wrote one more name on the list. Ellis Adira. A different kind of recruit. Not from the past, but from the future. A reminder that the work of service did not end when the war did. That dignity, honor, and quiet strength had to be passed on, not through orders, but through example. The conductor passed by, nodding at her respectfully, though he clearly didn't know who she was. Just an older woman with tired eyes and a military bearing. Elira closed the notebook, slipped it back into her coat, and leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. Her reflection looked back at her, not a hero, not a legend, just a woman who had carried her duty beyond the battlefield, through bureaucracy, through silence, and now into peace. The train continued into the night. Ahead, another city waited. Another day. Perhaps even a new purpose. She did not know exactly where it would take her, but for once that uncertainty felt welcome. The mission had ended. The war was long over. But the work, quiet, steady, invisible, would always go on. And so would she. The city was different than she remembered, though it wasn't one she had visited often. Smaller, quieter, its streets lined with low stone buildings and narrow lanes where the past clung to every corner. Elira stepped off the train as morning light filtered through a veil of soft fog, her breath visible in the early chill. The duffel hung over her shoulder, the same as always, though its weight seemed lighter now, not because she had emptied it, but because something inside her had settled. She walked without a map, instinct guiding her through unfamiliar streets that somehow felt known. Past a bakery opening for the day, its windows glowing with warmth. Past a cathedral with bells that rang once, low and distant. She paused only once at a small war memorial set in the middle of a square, unremarkable in design but meticulously maintained. Reeds lay at its base. Flags moved gently in the wind. She stepped closer, eyes scanning the names etched into the stone. They were not her comrades. Not her conflict. But they were someone's. And that was enough. She touched the edge of the granite lightly with her fingers and moved on. The address she finally approached was a modest row house, 3 stories tall, ivy curling up its brick facade. She knocked once, twice, then waited. A moment later, the door opened, revealing a man in his 40s, his shirt sleeves rolled up, eyes tired but kind. "You must be Elira," he said, his voice tinged with a faint European accent. "My grandfather told me you might come." Elira nodded. "He wrote me once. Said he'd saved a file for when the time was right." The man stepped aside to let her in. The interior was simple, bookshelves lining the walls, polished wood floors, a fire crackling in a narrow hearth. He led her upstairs, past closed doors and sunlit rooms, to an attic office where dust motes drifted in lazy spirals. In the corner was a locked metal cabinet, clearly military issue, worn but intact. "He gave me the key," the man said, handing her a small brass piece. Elira took it without hesitation, knelt before the cabinet and opened it. Inside, carefully preserved, were documents, old, yellowing, marked with redacted stamps and foreign seals. Photographs she hadn't seen in over 40 years. Maps annotated in her own hand. And near the bottom, a sealed envelope marked simply, "Thorn, eyes only." She opened it and read in silence. When she finished, she closed her eyes and rested her hand over the letter. "He kept his promise," she said quietly. The man said nothing, sensing that whatever passed between her and that envelope did not need witnesses. Elira took only a few things: a copy of the letter, 1 photograph, a map she had drawn in haste during a mission no one was supposed to remember. She left the rest. "What will you do with the rest of it?" the man asked. She studied him. "What would you do?" He hesitated, then said, "I'd protect it. Keep it safe. Until someone needs it again." She gave a faint nod. That's the right answer. When she left the house, the sun was stronger. The fog had lifted. Elira walked slowly toward the station, but she didn't board a train. Not yet. She found a bench in the square, sat down, and watched the world pass. She didn't look like anyone important. Not to the people hurrying past with coffee and briefcases. Just a woman with a far-off look in her eyes and a duffel bag at her feet. But inside her jacket was a folded map that had once led soldiers out of danger, a photograph of a team no one remembered, and a letter from a man who had lived in the shadows of the same truth. She was no longer waiting to be acknowledged. She had done what needed to be done. Not for applause. Not for history books. But because it had been necessary. And now, in the quiet hush of the morning, with the world waking gently around her, Elira finally allowed herself something she hadn't in years, not relief, not rest. Hope. Because somewhere, someone else would carry the next message. Walk the next path. And she had made sure the road was still there, waiting. The days that followed unfolded with a calm Elira hadn't experienced in decades. No schedules, no briefings, no encoded messages or redacted reports. Just time. She spent it moving deliberately, almost methodically, through the city and its quiet rhythms, visiting bookstores where no one recognized her, sipping tea in corner cafes, walking through parks as children played nearby and no one stared. It was a kind of anonymity she had earned the hard way, and she wore it like a second skin. But Alira was not idle. Her movements had purpose even if no one else could see it. She sent 3 letters, handwritten, sealed, and dropped at post offices miles apart. No return address. Only initials at the bottom. She visited a cemetery on the city's edge, placing a single pin, one of her old unit's unmarked insignia, on the grave of a woman buried under a civilian name. She paused there longer than she had intended, fingers brushing the cold stone, remembering the voice, the laughter, the impossible decision made in a jungle clearing far from here. "Still with me," she whispered. She did not cry. Alira had never needed tears to feel. Back in town, word was spreading quietly. Not about her, not directly, but about the moment at the checkpoint, now a muted ripple on news networks and military circles. The video had circulated, edited, interpreted. Anonymous veteran receives long overdue recognition, they said. There were comments, debates, analysis. But no one knew her name. No one had found her. That was intentional. Alira watched it once at an internet cafe, sound off, expression unreadable. When it ended, she deleted the browser history, stood, and walked out. It was on the 5th day that a letter reached her. Hand-delivered by a teenage courier who didn't know what he was carrying. The envelope bore no address, only a symbol. A broken compass. Alira's breath caught for half a second. She opened it with practiced care. Inside, a single sentence, "They're asking for you in Vienna." She didn't hesitate. That night, she packed her things, though most had never been unpacked, and purchased a train ticket under a name she hadn't used in 20 years. The uniform stayed folded in the bag. The medal she left behind in the drawer of a hotel desk, wrapped in a handkerchief with a note, "For the one who comes after." She traveled light. The journey to Vienna was long but familiar. The train crossed borders and landscapes she had once moved through unseen, but now viewed openly, like a passenger rather than a ghost. At a station outside Zurich, she saw a young woman in uniform helping an elderly man with his luggage. She gave him her seat, smiled without expectation. Alira watched the exchange in silence. The quiet service. The unnoticed dignity. She smiled just a little. When she arrived in Vienna, it was raining again. Of course it was. She made her way through narrow alleys to a door she remembered by instinct, not by address. She knocked once. Then twice. Then a third time slower. The door opened. A woman in her 70s stood there, short-cropped white hair and the same steel-gray eyes Alira remembered. "Alira," she said, as if it had only been a day. "Margot," Alira replied. No embrace. No pleasantries. Just the kind of reunion built not on affection but trust forged in fire. "They found something," Margot said. "In a vault outside Zagreb. Sealed with the old protocol. They asked for someone who still understood it. And they asked for me," Alira said. "You were the only one who ever understood it," Margot replied. They stepped inside. The door shut behind them. The past had called. And Alira Thorne, once captain, always soldier, answered it, because some people don't stop serving when the war ends. They simply wait for the next quiet mission, the one that only they can see. Because truth, like service, never really retires. The room beneath the safe house was colder than Alira remembered. Not from temperature alone, but from memory, sealed, sterile, buried. The walls were concrete, the lighting harsh and yellow, buzzing faintly like it always had in underground rooms built for secrets. Dust lingered in the corners, despite its recent use. Across from her, Margot stood beside a steel table, her fingers resting lightly on a black case marked with fading stamps, diplomatic, classified, and something else, something older. Alira recognized the sigil. A triangle inside a circle, surrounded by 12 stars. An old insignia. Disbanded. Disavowed. Never forgotten. "They found it here?" Alira asked. "In a custom storage vault under false inventory," Margot replied. "Sealed under a name no longer listed in any archive. But someone flagged it during a routine audit. A name they weren't supposed to recognize." Alira stepped closer. "Whose name?" Margot opened the case. Inside, layered in archival sleeves and protective foam, was a single red folder. Typed neatly on the tab, "A. Thorne." Alira didn't move. Didn't breathe. "Your brother," Margot said softly. "It's his." Or it was. The silence deepened. Alira reached for the folder with deliberate care. Her hands were steady, but inside her chest, something shifted, something ancient and unfinished. She had not spoken his name aloud in 40 years. Not since the day he disappeared during the early phase of Operation Halberd. Officially, he had never existed. Unofficially, he had been her shadow contact, her handler in the field. Her brother. She opened the folder. Inside, field reports, handwritten notes, a coded message log, and a photograph. 2 operatives standing in front of a vehicle destroyed by an IED. One was clearly Adrian Thorne. The other, her. She didn't remember the photo being taken. That wasn't surprising. Many things had happened without her knowledge, even in operations she had led. But this meant someone had been watching them. Someone had documented more than she ever knew. At the bottom of the folder was a single slip of paper brittle with age. On it, a ciphered message she instantly recognized. She didn't need a key. It was the same code she and Adrian had used when they were still young agents, before everything had turned cold and quiet. She translated aloud, softly, "If this reaches you, I failed. But the work isn't done. Resemblance was only the first door. They'll come looking for the rest. And when they do, don't let them rewrite it. Don't let them erase me." Elira closed the folder. Her jaw clenched. They always said he was compromised. That he turned. Margot nodded. That story came from high levels. Unquestioned. And convenient. But this proves he didn't. It proves he knew he wouldn't survive. And that he trusted you to finish it. Elira stared at the closed folder. The past wasn't done with her, not yet. This wasn't just about recognition anymore. It never had been. The truth had been buried too deeply, covered in layers of bureaucracy, deliberate erasure, and the silence demanded of patriots. She turned to Margot. Who else knows about this? Only the analyst who flagged the name. And she's been reassigned to Guam. Elira let out a quiet breath. Then it's clean. Still contained. Margot hesitated. Are you going to act on it? I already am, Elira said. She slid the folder into her duffel next to the old notebook, the photograph, the map. It's time people knew what really happened. But not through speeches or ceremonies. I'm going to show them, one piece at a time. Margot gave a tight smile. One mission left in you after all. No, Elira corrected, shouldering the bag. Just one truth. And I'm done letting others speak it for me. She left the bunker without another word. Outside, the Vienna air was colder now, but sharp with clarity. She blended back into the city as she always had, invisible but present, a figure in the background who had shaped more history than most would ever know. They thought she was done. They thought she'd been honored and retired. But Elira Thorne wasn't finished. She had a brother to restore, a legacy to protect, and a lie to burn to the ground quietly, methodically, and absolutely. Elira moved through Prague with the ease of someone who had once memorized its streets not for sightseeing but for survival. The city had changed, new storefronts, electric trams, surveillance in places where shadows used to rule, but the bones were the same. She navigated alleyways and courtyards without hesitation, passing unnoticed among tourists and residents, her presence quiet and unremarkable. Tucked inside her coat was Adrian's folder, now accompanied by 3 corroborating documents obtained through channels that no longer officially existed. Names, mission briefings, satellite photos, each one marked with dates that had been purged from the public record. She had no intention of releasing them all at once. That was not the way you dismantled a lie. Not with a bomb, but with pressure. Persistent, undeniable pressure. One detail at a time. One truth that couldn't be explained away. She met her contact at a cafe that had once been a safe house. The woman was younger than expected, early 30s, glasses, a tactical watch beneath a simple blazer. She spoke without pretense. I don't know who you are, but I know what this is. She tapped the envelope Elira had passed across the table. And if even half of this is real, it's all real, Elira said evenly. The woman nodded, clearly uneasy. It matches fragments we've been collecting. Stories that never made sense until now. You're confirming a buried network that stretches back 40 years. Elira sipped her tea. Not confirming. Releasing. Slowly. Responsibly. You'll get the rest when I know you'll protect it. Why now? The woman asked. Why not stay hidden? Elira looked out the window where snow had begun to fall gently on the cobblestones. Because someone tried to erase my brother. And in doing so, they erased too many others. This isn't about revenge. It's about setting the record straight before history finishes the rewrite. The woman leaned back. You don't want credit? I want accuracy, Elira replied. I want dignity restored to people who were buried under silence. No headlines. No spotlights. Just the truth. Quietly placed where it cannot be ignored. They parted with no handshake, no exchange of names. Elira left by the back door, disappearing into the soft curtain of snow. By dusk, she was at a train station again, this time not to run, but to reach. The next city, the next thread. She had begun something now that could not be undone. The first leak appeared online within 48 hours, an internal memo from a Cold War archive with redactions circled in red, annotated by the journalist she had chosen. It caused no uproar, no scandal. Just questions. Small at first. Measured. The kind that would grow. Back in her hotel, Elira stood at the window watching the snowfall deepen. In her hand was a small photograph, one she hadn't shared with anyone. Adrian, younger than she remembered, smiling in a way he never had once the missions began. She placed it carefully into the pages of her old notebook beside the names of the lost. She had kept her promise. She was still keeping it. And somewhere beneath the shifting noise of politics and narratives, the truth was waking. Not with fury, but with resolve. The kind that endures. The kind that finishes what it started. The message came encrypted, buried inside an innocuous email header from a decades-old account no one was supposed to remember. Elira read it in silence from a public terminal in a nondescript library in Bratislava. The signal was simple: Vault Echo active. Immediate presence required. No signature. None needed. She logged off, destroyed the drive, and left without haste. Vault Echo had been a contingency, one she and Adrian designed in the late 70s when they realized their own command structure couldn't be trusted. A place not on any official map where the raw, unfiltered intelligence of their operations was duplicated and stored. A failsafe against corruption. A time bomb for the truth. Elira had hoped it would never be activated. By nightfall, she was in a car heading northeast, moving through forests thick with frost and fog, the mountains rising like sentinels on the horizon. The driver didn't speak, he didn't need to. His silence told her he understood what they were approaching. It wasn't just another archive. It was the heart of what had been erased. They reached the compound at dawn, a structure built into the side of a cliff, hidden beneath layers of rock and reinforced steel. There were no guards. There didn't need to be. Access required something more powerful than firepower: memory. She placed her hand on the scanner, and when it failed to recognize her aged, weathered, different, she spoke a phrase only two people had ever known. 47 birds return. The system paused, then accepted her. The door opened. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. Lights flickered on one by one, illuminating row after row of sealed canisters, paper archives, early data drives, reel-to-reel recordings. She moved with precision, bypassing the misdirections they'd installed decades ago, files meant to confuse, delay, expose any intruder. She headed straight to Section 7. The vault was untouched. She opened the central case and found exactly what she feared and expected: full operation logs of missions long denied. Not just Resemblance. Not just Halberd, but entire operations across continents, interventions, preventions, black site extractions. Unnamed heroes. Silent betrayals. Confirmations that some of the worst assumptions had been true and that some had been worse than imagined. She pulled one document, carefully scanned it, and felt her hands tighten as she read: Order 39A, Thorn subject to neutralization protocol in event of exposure. They hadn't just buried Adrian. They had marked him for deletion. And her. A sound echoed in the distance. Not mechanical. Human. She turned, every reflex still alive inside her despite the years. A shadow moved between the shelves, slow, measured. Elira waited in the silence. Then a voice. Low. Familiar. You took longer than I thought. She stepped into the aisle and saw him. Leaner. Grayer. But alive. Adrian, not a ghost. Not a recording. Not a memory. Her brother. They stared at each other for a long moment, the weight of 4 lost decades pressing into the space between them. No words passed. None were needed. Finally, he said, It's time, isn't it? Elira nodded once. It is. He stepped forward, opened a second case beside hers. Inside were duplicates of the same evidence she had recovered in Vienna, Prague, Zurich, files they had split before the fall, insurance against what they couldn't stop. Together, now, they had everything. Together, they would finish it because some truths couldn't be told by one person alone. And some reckonings required the return of the dead. They worked in silence at first, 2 shadows moving through the forgotten bones of their former lives. Elira and Adrian spread out the documents across a long metal table in Vault Echo's central chamber: maps, ciphers, transcripts of meetings that had never been acknowledged, orders never signed but executed all the same. It was all here, preserved like a wound sealed beneath ice, waiting for the right hands to thaw it open. Adrian spoke only when necessary, his voice roughened by years in exile. The plan hasn't changed, he said. We release it slowly, precisely. No shockwaves. Just the truth, undeniable and unspinnable. Elira nodded, already sorting the evidence into tiers, prioritizing what could be verified first. We start with Halberd. Then Vires. Resemblance last. Why last? He asked, knowing but wanting to hear her say it. Because they already believe it happened. They just don't know what it cost. Outside, the storm began to roll in over the mountains, winds sweeping across the peaks like ghosts returning home. Inside, the siblings moved through years of betrayal and buried loyalty, their every gesture shaped by muscle memory and quiet resolve. They no longer needed mission briefings or command structures. This was their command now, two people who had once been erased reclaiming the story line by line. At night, they took turns resting in shifts, keeping watch not out of paranoia but out of principle. The world hadn't become safer just because it had stopped watching them. By the third day, the first leak had already gained traction. A redacted recording from 1981 featuring voices that had been classified as non-existent now matched with living former operatives who could no longer be dismissed. A quiet inquiry was launched. No public statements were made, but messages began flowing through encrypted networks, recognition from old allies, from forgotten names who had always wondered what happened to the Thorne siblings. Some offered help. Others offered warning. A few simply said thank you. On the seventh day, as dawn broke across the jagged skyline, Elira and Adrian stood outside the vault, their work complete. The final packets were timed to release over the coming months through whistleblowers, international watchdogs, private journalists trained to recognize what mattered and what didn't. There would be no speech, no books, no confessions. Just truth entering the world as it always should have, quietly, undeniably, and too late to be silenced. Adrian looked out at the rising sun, his breath fogging in the cold. They'll try to rewrite us again. Elira watched the light strike the snow-dusted peaks. They can try, but this time the truth won't need our names to live. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. Hours later, the vault sealed for the final time, its contents backed, copied, and scattered. The safe house would be abandoned, stripped, made untraceable. The Thorns didn't need it anymore. Their story had never belonged to one room. It had always lived in the shadows between actions and memory. By the end of the week, they had vanished again, together this time. No footprints. No signatures. Just the ripples of something long buried returning to the surface. In the months that followed, changes began in small, stubborn places. Military archives revised footnotes. Families received letters confirming medals long denied. A senator quietly referenced Special Operations Group Delta on record for the first time in congressional history. And in a modest museum tucked inside a European capital, a new exhibit opened. Unseen, the agent's history forgot. No names. No photographs. Only a single display case containing a worn duffel bag, a folded uniform jacket, and a small brass pin resting beside a faded map. Beneath it, engraved in both English and Czech, a simple inscription. Dignity is not what you are given. It is what you carry. The visitors passed by quietly. And somewhere far beyond the cities, beyond the headlines and the legacy machine, two figures walked side by side across a border with no checkpoint. Older. Silent. Unburdened. Not heroes. Just siblings. Just truth.